Well, gang, it's that time of year again. The air is getting crisper, the leaves are turning brown and orange and falling to the ground. People are drinking pumpkin spice lattes. But most importantly, I get to break out my flannel. Not only are flannel shirts stylish and functional, keeping you warm in the autumnal landscape while making you look
rugged and tough,
but the added layer of clothing also helps with my body dysmorphia. Flannel shirts always remind me of a certain era of music. One of the best and most well-loved genres in music. Of course, I'm talking about grunge.
Touch me, I'm sick.
Hello and welcome back to another video. If you're new here, I'm Trevor and I am eternally uncool. I make videos about music, music culture, and anything that interests me. But mostly music right now. So if that sounds like something you'd be into, then I highly recommend subscribing to the channel and watching the rest of this video. The 1990s was one of the best decades for music. Not only did you have the burgeoning college radio sound of the late 80s crossing over with bands like R.E.M. and The Smiths, but you had a whole new crop of alternative artists coming out. You had the Bay Area punk of Green Day, The Offspring, and Rancid, the shoegaze of My Bloody Valentine, the more pop rock oriented sounds of Third Eye Blind and Counting Crows. But I think the most important genre of this decade, and some of the most important bands, is grunge and grunge bands.
Grunge is the fashion trend launched by the hard-driving guitar music known as the Seattle Sound.
Grunge was born out of the Seattle underground with bands like Green River and labels like Sub Pop. It took the energy and ethos of punk bands like Black Flag and mixed it with the sludgier, metallic sound of something like Black Sabbath. There are also some lo-fi elements due to most bands being broke and not able to afford very good equipment. But despite that, grunge became a force within the music world of the early 90s. When most people think about grunge, they think about bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, Alice in Chains, Soundgarden, but you also have less well-known acts like Tad and Babes in Toyland and Toadies. A lot of these bands did have their 15 minutes of fame though after major labels saw what was happening when Nirvana became the biggest band in the world. But after Kurt Cobain's demise, many of these bands were lost in the shuffle. Eventually, we'd get the subgenre of post-grunge, who watered down the sound of grunge immensely and made it more commercial. And eventually, grunge and post-grunge would fall out of popularity and just disappear. But as we entered the 2010s, we started getting bands that emulated the classic sound of 90s grunge. Of course, none of these bands were as big as Nirvana or Stone Temple Pilots, and grunge wasn't really the force in music that it once was. But these bands were giving it a new lease on life. All of them were playing what sounded like 90s grunge, but adding something new and interesting to it. If you're as deep into music as I am, then you know that grunge is still alive and kicking, albeit in a more low-key fashion. Yeah, you have bands with bigger followings like Title Fight and Turnover, but there's bands that I don't think a lot of people know about. Or maybe they've just been overlooked. But not by me. Oh no.
Not by me.
What I want to do today is take a look at some of my favorite modern grunge bands. I feel like grunge is the perfect music to listen to during the fall season. And a lot of these newer bands have a kind of autumn vibe that just feels right. So if you're interested in jumping into a new era of grunge with me, stick around. Grab a drink, grab a snack, grab your flannel, and let's get into the video. The first entry on this list is a double entry, because both bands share a similar vibe, sound, and frontman in Taylor Madison. We'll talk about Superheaven first, since they're the older band. Superheaven was formed in 2008 in Doylestown, Pennsylvania, under the name Daylight. They would release 2 EPs under this name, Sinking in 2009, and Disparate in 2010. They would also release copies of their debut album, Jar, under this name in 2013, but would ultimately enter into a legal dispute with a Spanish band of the same name. So they were forced to change it in 2014 to Superheaven, which I think is a much cooler name. I didn't discover Superheaven until probably my first year of college. I've said before that around this time I was getting really into the emo revival of the 2010s. And Superheaven was kind of a part of that, in a way. They weren't really emo, but they were kind of adjacent to that sound. They were on Run for Cover, which was my favorite label during the whole emo revival heyday. When I was in my emo revival phase, I was reading a lot of alternative press, Kerrang, and Rock Sound. Rock Sound was my favorite because it came with a CD. These CDs featured bands that were in that particular issue, or just bands that were popping off at the time. One of the issues I bought had a CD that included the Superheaven song, Life in a Jar. When I first heard this song, I was blown away by the sound. It really had that kind of classic Alice in Chains, grimy, sludgy, grunge sound. But it still fitted in with the rest of the music that I was listening to at the time. I was immediately hooked. I wanted more. I somehow managed to acquire their debut album, Jar, on vinyl. I don't remember how. It was either bought on Amazon or at Hot Topic during one of their phases where they sell vinyls in their stores. Not this copy though. This is the 10-year anniversary copy that I got from their site. The album sounds like it could have been a relic from the 90s. A hidden gem. There's very little hints of the 2010s here. Maybe the higher production quality could give it away, but the sludginess, the lo-fi guitar, the heavy drums, and Taylor's gruff vocals sound like they wouldn't be out of place in Olympia in 1992. The opening track, Sponge, has a lot of energy while still being a little bit more low-key than some of the classic 90s grunge music. Sheltered sounds like the greatest Nirvana song that Kurt never got the chance to write. And of course, you can't forget the viral smash hit, Youngest Daughter.
It's useless. I tried, but no event.
I seriously cannot recommend this album enough. It's perfect for anyone who's a fan of the darker, sludgier 90s grunge sound of bands like Alice in Chains or Soundgarden. Superheaven would go on hiatus, and frontman Taylor Madison and guitarist Jake Clark would form the band Webbed Wing in 2017. Webbed Wing has a much softer, mellower sound than Superheaven. It's definitely more of an indie rock kind of vibe, but there's still that grunginess there, albeit a little bit more polished and refined. Superheaven is good for the aggressive basement show, while Webbed Wing fits better with an introspective walk with leaves crunching beneath your feet and a flannel giving you a warm hug. I highly recommend both these bands if you enjoy the classic grunge and alternative sound of the 90s, because they definitely have it. You know, sometimes the YouTube algorithm sends you something really strange and weird and sometimes genuinely fantastic. You'll get a weird video that might lead you to following a really cool artistic channel. Maybe you'll get in on the ground floor of a viral clip. And sometimes you get recommended kick-ass music like Fleshwaterer. Fleshwaterer was formed in 2017 in Boston, Massachusetts by guitarist and vocalist Anthony DiDio, drummer Matt Wood, and bassist Jeremy Martin, all three of whom are members of hardcore band Vane FM. And they rounded out the lineup with lead vocalist Marissa Sherrar. DiDio, Wood, and Sherrar would write the band's first single, Linda Claire. This song alone gained them a lot of recognition and 1 million Spotify listeners. In 2022, the band released their debut album, We're Not Here to Be Loved. This album did pretty good, getting a 7.5 from Pitchfork, with them saying, Fleshwaterer bound ahead of their peers by making the familiar exciting again. And they do have a familiar sound, even more familiar than Superheaven. There's that hardcore influence from the main three musicians. And Sherrar's vocals range from dreamy and quiet to loud and anthemic. As of right now, Fleshwaterer has 1 album and 2 EPs. But I can see the potential for them to be a big name. They harken back to the female-fronted bands of the 90s, like Veruca Salt and Hole. So if that sounds like your thing, then I highly recommend giving Fleshwaterer a listen. When I was in college, I remember being hungry for new music. And just hungry in general. I didn't have a job most of the time. I couldn't pay for food. I would go looking for new bands in alternative press and rock sound and YouTube, places like that. Sometimes I would see my favorite artists recommend unknown bands on Twitter, back when Twitter was bearable. And I have a distinct memory of Gerard Way sharing a link for a song by a band or an artist called The Chain Gang of 1974. The Chain Gang of 1974 is an electronic rock project started by Campton Mohager. Mohager started out playing bass for acts like 303 before he started releasing his own music. By 2015, Mohager was playing bass and providing vocals for the band Teenage Wrists. Mohager would record Teenage Wrist's debut album, Chrome Neon Jesus, in 2018, but he would leave the band in 2019. He would continue making music as the Chain Gang of 1974, but in August of 2020, he announced that he was working on a grunge project called Heavenword. In September of the same year, he released the project's debut single, Hole. The song has a similar vibe to Superheaven in its kind of dreamy and muddy guitars, but Mohager's vocals are much nicer and prettier than Taylor Madison's. It kind of feels more shoegazy than grunge, but it's too late to rewrite this entry, so... In June of 2023, Heavenword released its debut album, Pyrophonics. This album incorporates a bit of space rock into the grungy sound, similar to a band like Failure. There's a lot of energy on this album. It definitely has the same kind of energy as a lot of the more punk-inspired grunge bands. Songs like Choke have a bit of a pop song quality to them as well, but there's still that underlying grungy and lo-fi-ness. If you enjoy a spacey, more emo version of grunge, something similar to bands like Failure, Hum, and Far, then I highly recommend checking out Heavenword. Narrowhead is one of those grungy, shoegazy bands that have been gaining a lot of attention within recent years. They mix the emo revival sound with distorted guitars and dreamy vibes, while also incorporating elements of post-hardcore and alternative metal. And it's great. It's legitimately great. And not just in terms of the grunge revival or new gaze. It's just flat out good on its own merit. Narrowhead was formed in 2013 in Dallas, Texas. They were inspired by bands like Deftones and My Bloody Valentine. They released 2 EPs before releasing their debut album, Satisfaction. The album definitely has that dreamy vibe to it with its guitars and vocals, but there's also kind of a turnstile vibe. It sounds more like melodic hardcore, which I guess you could also use that term to describe grunge. They would eventually sign to Run for Cover Records, much like Superheaven before them. And on Run for Cover, they would release their second album, 12th House Rock, in 2020. This was around the time that I really started to take notice of them. Like I said, I'm a big fan of RFC as a label. They always have some pretty great bands on their roster. I try to check out most of them, and when I found this album and this band, I was blown away. This album really feels like it amplified the grunge influences, especially with the opening track, Your Song. It sounds like it could have been a lost sub-pop hit from the 90s. And songs like the title track have these really great distorted guitars that mix perfectly with the dreamy vocals. And the song Night Tryst is just so high energy and fun to listen to. I think Narrowhead really started to get a lot more attention when they released their third album, Moments of Clarity, in 2023. It was getting rave reviews from publications like Pitchfork, Kerrang, Sputnik Music, and comparing them to artists like Smashing Pumpkins. And I gotta say, I agree with the hype. Narrowhead does a really good job of crafting a sound that incorporates elements of 90s grunge, shoegaze, hardcore, and mixing it all with emotional songwriting and catharsis, which I think was one of the appeals of the original genre of grunge. It was a genre that was cathartic and raw and emotional, and that's exactly what Narrowhead is. If you like your grunge mixed with a little bit of shoegaze, a little dream pop, and a little hardcore, then I highly recommend checking out Narrowhead. What do you think? Are there any modern grunge bands that you like that I forgot to mention? Are you a fan of classic grunge? Let me know in the comments. That's gonna do it for today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, then I recommend smashing that like button and sharing this video with everyone you know. As you know, I'm a small, independent content creator who pretty much does everything on his own. So every like, every comment, every share, any interaction with this video at all really helps me out. With all that being said, thank you for watching. As always, I'm Trevor, stay uncool. And that's the end of the video, goodbye.